Hi, and welcome to Five Best Practices in Data-Driven Selling, a one-to-one webinar sponsored by Ravana. I'm Tom Hoffman at One to One Media, and I'll be the moderator for today's event, where we'll explore best practices for leveraging customer and prospect data to improve customer retention, to drive higher conversion rates, and to boost customer value. Our speakers today are Don Peppers, who's founding partner at Peppers & Rogers Group, and Jonathan Gray, Vice President of Marketing at Ravana. Don and Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here, Tom.
Thanks for including me. Thanks.
Sure. So before we review the full agenda, I'd like to take a walk through the ON24 interface to help familiarize our attendees with the platform. First, please turn off your pop-up blockers to enable interactive features. To download a copy of today's slides, please click on the green resource widget. If you have a question for one of our presenters, please click on the red Q&A widget and then type in your question and hit submit. If you encounter any technical issues during the webinar, please click on the help button located in the center of the toolbar. To learn more about our featured speakers, please click on the blue Speaker Bios tab in the lower right-hand corner of the toolbar. Also, feel free to tweet about today's webinar using the hashtag that's shown here. Now for today's agenda. In this webinar, our presenters will provide insights on the following: how customer data and statistical reasoning can be used to help companies achieve sales potential and to maximize customer value. We'll also explore the techniques that can be used to drive incremental sales from existing customers. Further, we'll examine how to increase inbound upsell cross-sell rates by matching callers with historical transactional and behavioral data. We'll also look at how predictive models and analytics can be used to forecast customers' potential value and to help prioritize leads. And then finally, we'll take a look at how leading companies are using data-driven selling to optimize business performance, including the use of customer data to help extend the life cycle of current customers that are at risk of being lost. And this will be followed by an audience Q&A with our speakers. So as we've come to learn, customers that are armed with smartphones and tablets and other web-enabled devices have more choices than ever between the products and the services that they buy. And because customers have so many options available to them, it's critical for companies to be able to develop effective engagement strategies for connecting with the right customers, but also for providing the right messaging through the most effective channels that they use. Of course, in order to engage effectively with customers and prospects, companies also need to draw upon what's known about them, their transaction histories, the channels that they use for different purposes, along with their interests and their needs. Fortunately, customers and prospects share quite a bit of this information about themselves through their omni-channel interactions. And this digital trail of information that customers and prospects leave behind them provides sales teams with incredible insights about their behaviors, about their needs, and their interests that can be analyzed and acted on to help drive higher conversion rates. Companies that are particularly adept at using customer data can strengthen the execution of their sales strategies and then deliver improved business performance. And here we're pointing to a 2002 study conducted by Aberdeen Group, where best-in-class companies, or as Aberdeen cites them, the top 20% of companies analyzed, have achieved significantly higher year-over-year increases in their attainment of team sales quota compared to companies that are considered to be industry average as well as underperforming or laggard companies. So clearly, companies that make effective use of customer data better position themselves to deliver more relevant and personalized messaging and offers that can result in improved business performance compared to organizations that overlook these opportunities. So at this point, I'd like to turn the discussion over to Don Peppers, who will share deeper insights with us on the business value of evidence-based decision-making. Don?
Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much, Tom. And I think that graph that we have up here talking about the divergence of performance of those companies that use data wisely versus those companies that are data laggards is quite telling. And in the rest of the webinar, Jonathan and I are going to try to talk to you a little bit about some of the practices that set these good performers up. Fundamentally around statistical reasoning. We talked about statistical reasoning. I'm going to spend a lot of time on that issue and evidence-based management. Now, we're here because primarily of Moore's Law. Everybody knows what Moore's Law. Every 20 years, computers get 1,000 times faster and cheaper. And people sometimes forget about what this really means, but we're now at a stage where computers are generating a ton of data, and I'm sure you've all heard this kind of statistic, but just in the last 2 days, we created every bit as much information as we did from the dawn of civilization up until 2003. That's the rate at which data is being thrown off by the computers that are running everything. I'll give you some other figures. Every second on the New York Stock Exchange, 33,000 securities trades take place. And, of course, every trade has to trade. It has to trade in a precise order, don't they? You have to keep track of those orders exactly. And, in fact, Google processes a petabyte of data every hour, and YouTube uploads 8 years' worth of video every single day. So Moore's Law means that these trends are going to continue to accelerate. But there's a corollary to Moore's Law that's sometimes colloquially known as Zuckerberg's Law. Every 20 years, we interact 1,000 times as much with others, 1,000 times more with others. So computers get, and if you think about your life as a consumer, 20 years ago, before you might have had a cell phone on you, before some people didn't even have email addresses 20 years ago for work. Nobody had broadband. There was no Facebook. There was no LinkedIn, no YouTube, no status updates of Twitter or text messaging. Today, you interact about 1,000 times as much with others, more with others, as you did back then. And 20 years from now, your children will interact 1,000 times more than you do with their friends and associates. Many of those interactions are automated. Some of them are algorithmic. That is, they're run on a kind of a formula basis by your own thing, but by your own technology. But the point is, it's driving consumers closer and closer to analyzing the buying process. There's something called the zero moment of truth. That's a term that was coined, I think, by Google. Jim Lisinski's book, Winning the Zero Moment of Truth, coined this term ZMOT. And ZMOT is that moment when a customer is Googling a product to compare prices while she's standing right in the store aisle. That's what you would call a ZMOT. Or a customer scans reviews of a product while sitting in a car in the store's parking lot, or even more, a customer checks the opinions of social network friends about a store before choosing which one to visit. Those are all zero moments of truth. Google did this research. They basically they looked at a number of different things. They looked at how consumers got online referrals from friends, whether a consumer became a friend or a follower of a brand. They looked at the blogs that consumers looked at, and mentions of brands on different networking sites, social networking sites, like Facebook and so forth. In analyzing all this data, what Google found, interesting enough, is that the rate at which these ZMOTs are increasing is accelerating. And in fact, in just the last couple of years, for instance, in 2010, the average shopper consulted 5 sources during a ZMOT. In 2011, the average consumer consulted 10. It's doubled in just the last year. And in 2010, only 19% of shoppers checked social sources, friends or friends of friends, But by 2011, that had also doubled to 37%. So there's a tremendous pace at which consumers are giving themselves access to this amount of this surplus of data that's out there. They're interacting with their friends. They're interacting with stores and brands and so forth. They're mining this data themselves. And the thing is, the more we interact, the more service we demand. Because think about it, we want interactions to be more efficient. So when you interact with a brand, you don't want to have any hassle. You want a frictionless customer experience. You don't want to have to reconstruct some fact that they omitted or check some issue that looks like they're biased on. In fact, we have a lot less patience with brands that can't interact at our own speed. We need the brands to interact at our speed, not yesterday's speed, but today's speed. And this brings me to another point, because the more interaction we have, the more trust we demand also. Now, consumer trust has always been important in businesses, right? It's always been a vital thing to have the trust of your customers. So that's nothing new. But what does trust really mean? Well, if I'm going to trust you as your customer, then what I'm saying is I trust your intentions. I trust that you're going to act in my interest. All right. But more than that, I'm going to trust your competence. I'm going to trust that you're competent to carry out these intentions. And both those things have to be positive. Look at if you're in the position of that baby being thrown up in the air by his dad. Okay, he's got two questions in his mind: is his dad competent enough to catch him on his way down, and does his dad want to catch him on his way down? Right. So both those things have to be positive for me to trust you. Another way you could look at this is competence is doing things right, and good intentions is doing the right thing. You could look at it that way. Well, there's now a higher standard. Because we interact so much with others, it's no longer enough simply to refrain from cheating or deceiving customers. It used to be that if you didn't cheat anybody and you didn't lie to them, then you were basically honest and people would trust you. But that's not enough anymore. In fact, what consumers expect is they expect proactive trustworthiness. They want you to proactively protect their interests. The other day I was looking through an article, and it had mentioned a book that I hadn't got yet, and I thought, well, I really ought to get that book. So I went right to Amazon, where I'm a subscriber to Amazon, a member of Amazon, and I navigated to the book. I clicked on it, so it would come to my house with one click. They already have my credit card information. They already have my address. It's a very convenient service. But I clicked on this book to order it, and instead of getting the book, I got a warning message from Amazon. Warning, you already bought this book from Amazon. Are you sure you want to buy it again? Now, just think about that for a second, because Amazon could easily have just sold me this book. It was my mistake, not theirs, that I was ordering a second copy. I forgot that I already had it, but that was my mistake. I wouldn't suspect them of cheating me if they just proceeded with my order. But what they're doing instead is they're using their database of data, their data, which is far superior to my database, to remind me that I'm about to act not in my own interest. And what do they get from it? They don't get the sale, but they get my trust. They get my relationship. They get my long-term loyalty as a customer. And this proactive trustworthiness is an important enough quality that Martha Rogers and I call it trustability. When we use the term trustability, what we're talking about is being proactively trustworthy with your customers. So if you go back to that original definition of trust, extreme trust or trustability is doing things right, doing the right thing proactively. Now, we're all surrounded by data, right? Lots and lots of data. But there's a logical question to ask. How do you decide what data to trust? Well, Martha and I suggest that if trust in another person or party is based on your assessment of that person's competence and good intentions, then trust in data or information is based on whether you assess that information to be accurate and objective. Accurate means it's competent, it represents reality to the best of its ability, and objective means it's unbiased. It has your best interests at heart. It's not trying to sell you something. It's not trying to bias your conclusion, whatever. Accurate and objective or unbiased. I think as we go into the data-rich future, more and more of this kind of information test is going to be required of companies, and assessing information that's accurate and objective and understanding what it means for a business really requires better business practices on the part of executives, something that I sometimes call evidence-based management. You may have heard of the movement evidence-based medicine in doctors' offices. The AMA recommends that doctors practice evidence-based medicine. What they mean by that is before they diagnose a patient, they look up the symptoms and they look at what the data says. In other words, they try to withhold their judgment and remain open-minded until they at least review the existing data and refresh their memories about what the data has shown so far. Unfortunately, most people don't do this. Intuitively, what we do instead is we leap to a conclusion based on a hunch, and then what we end up doing is we screen the data and look for data that supports our contention, our idea. We are prone to the confirmation bias. But that's not the scientific method. The scientific method is based on accuracy and objectivity. Karl Popper said, something is scientific if it's inherently disprovable. The only kind of scientific theory that is valid is one that has some conditions under which you could say this theory is false. That would be a scientific theory. And one of the important roles of scientists is they're constantly trying to disprove the theories that they already believe in. In fact, all science is a process of revising existing beliefs and theories and making them more and more sophisticated. One process in evidence-based management that companies need to understand is the issue of test and control. Test and control. You've probably heard of A/B testing, where I've got a website and I put up one advertisement to one audience, and an identical audience I put up another advertisement. So it's a advertisement and a B advertisement, and I test them. Google's a master of this. They run literally millions of A/B tests daily, constantly checking and tweaking and checking and tweaking. What a lot of people don't realize statistically is that when you run your test and you come up with the right result, you come up with the ad that draws the best, let's say, or the offer that sells the most, and then you roll it out. The rollout almost always, much more often than not, the rollout underperforms the test. Now, why would that be? Why would that happen? This is an issue of statistical reasoning. This is the kind of thing that you have to be able to understand as an executive dealing with a data-rich world. The test is likely to be underperformed by the rollout primarily because it was a test, and you test hundreds of things. Those tests will vary a little bit randomly. The tests that for random reasons score well, you're going to roll them out, okay? But the tests that for random reasons score low, you don't roll those out. So there's a kind of a one-way error introduced in your option to choose which to run with. That's a principle of statistical reasoning. And you should always test the null hypothesis. I mentioned in the scientific method, scientists are always trying to disprove their hypothesis, trying to test the negative. That's a very, very important point for businesses around the world. Let me tell you an interesting story that illustrates this point. In the World War II time frame, the Allies were sending out waves of strategic bombers over Europe. And in the initial part of the air war, they would sometimes lose 10 to 15% of the bombers would not return. They were massive and unacceptable losses. Clearly, they can't sustain those kinds of losses for the duration of the war. They can't lose 10 to 15% of their bombers on every run. Now, all these bombers were brought down by flak damage. And flak, anti-aircraft flak, was basically they send up, the Germans would send up anti-aircraft shells up into the air, and these shells would burst. They're like grenades going off randomly in the air. And some of the grenades would bring planes down and some didn't. And so it was clear that the Allies needed to place armor on their airplanes. But where? Should they place armor around the engines? Would that make more of their bombers to return? Or should they protect the cockpit? Is it the fuel tanks that they have to put armor around? And obviously they can't armor the whole airplane because it would be too heavy. They not only wouldn't be able to take off with bombs, it probably wouldn't be able to take off at all. They can only armor a few places on the airplane. So the way they decided what places to place armor on these bombers was they looked at all the returning bombers. They did a statistical analysis of all the returning bombers, and they analyzed what places on these returning bombers suffered no or little flak damage. And those are the places on the bombers that they began arming for future missions. Why? Because it's obvious. The airplanes that had suffered damage on those places didn't return, did they? And that's an example of null hypothesis. But let me give you a practical example in business terms. There is a European bank, Team Bank, that grants mortgages to homeowners. Every year they grant millions of homeowner mortgages, and also every year they intentionally grant thousands of loans to unqualified applicants who clearly do not qualify under their criteria for mortgages. And so the question is, why? Why would Team Bank do this? Well, they do it for evidence-based reasons. They do it because they're testing the null hypothesis. They're testing whether their criteria are accurate or not. Maybe their criteria are wrong. So here's a homeowner, a person who wants to be a homeowner, wants to borrow, doesn't qualify for some reason, but Team Bank selects them out, grants the loan on a random basis, and then tracks the performance of the loan. And suddenly, guess what? They've got this homeowner that didn't qualify, but now he's actually paying the loan off, and the loan performs very well. Guess what? They've just proved their criteria may not be as valid as they thought it was, and so they're constantly tweaking and updating their criteria. Now, none of the ideas that I've given you require you to be able to calculate a standard deviation or a variance correlation. You don't have to do the math. Computers will do the math. But human beings have to, business managers have to be capable of this kind of strategic reasoning in order to deal with the data that we're being surrounded with. And now we're entering the era of big data. What big data really means, what it really means is that there are things that you can do today on a large scale that simply cannot be done on a smaller scale. Waves, mountains of data are being thrown off by the computer programs and web browsers and other machine tools that we use in our daily business existence. Now, let me give you some examples. Zoom is a money transfer website, and they noticed that there was a slight aberration in the number of Discover Card transactions originating from New Jersey, and this actually revealed a criminal ring's activity just through a scan of the big data. Or consider a company called AirSage. They use the geolocations of millions of mobile phones, which they can collect automatically, and they do real-time traffic reports in more than 100 U.S. cities. It's residue from the data. Or there's a company called MarketPsych, and they do real-time sentiment analysis. They compile indices across 119 countries on a minute-by-minute basis to measure sentiment. Okay, so they can measure when the sentiment is turning up or turning down in a particular country, and they sell this data for quite a bit of money to investors and hedge funds. big-time companies that want to invest billions of dollars before the markets in the countries they're investing in figure out that the mood is about to turn south and so forth. Let me give you another example of a big data company. And let's start with the problem that it was trying to solve, which has to do with the Consumer Price Index. Now, the Consumer Price Index costs $250 million a year to maintain. It's maintained by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the Department of Labor by the U.S. government. Department of Treasury. More than 80,000 prices are sampled monthly. Weeks are required to prepare each Consumer Price Index report, and that's the way the CPI is produced by the government. So two professors at MIT launched a business called PriceStats. What PriceStats does is it crawls the web for over 500,000 prices on a daily basis. That's 200 times as much data as the CPI uses, okay? And they generate real-time, day-to-day price inflation information, which they sell to banks, media, and citizens. Importantly, you don't have to wait 6 weeks to get the data. You remember when the Lehman Brothers meltdown occurred in September 2008, and it took 6 weeks. So, economists expected that bankruptcy would cause a deflationary fluctuation in the economy, and it did, but it was 6 weeks before the CPI pointed out. But PriceStats pointed it out the next day. The price deflation became evident literally the next day and within the next few days after the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. So what PriceStats does is compiles real-time data for countries. So let me give you an example. Here is a graph of CPI is the blue line, which only comes out every month or so, right? And the purple line is PriceStats data, which is more real-time. And by the way, PriceStats data is available in real-time. So these are the CPI data that you see for October 2008 wasn't available till November 2008, for instance. Okay, but you can see how closely the PriceStats data tracks with the CPI in the U.S. Something very interesting that PriceStats has found out by doing this in countries around the world is that there are some countries that aren't quite as honest with their inflation figures. Here is Argentina's official CPI data, the blue line, and the real inflation rate, which is measured by PriceStats, is that purple line. And this points out something very interesting about big data, about the surplus of data that we're entering, the amazing amount of data right now. What it points out is that data operates like transparency, okay? It increases the amount of transparency in a system, and transparency is like a disinfectant for businesses and governments. It's going to clean things up, but first, it's going to sting like hell. So we're entering a very transparent world. As consumers, you have access to more data than ever before. Today's big company analytics program is tomorrow's consumer smartphone app. How do you make money as a business in this kind of world? And that's what Jonathan is going to talk to you about next. There are 5 practices for data-driven selling, 5 best practices for data-driven selling. Jonathan, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Don. That was awesome. And I'm looking forward to sharing best practices in data-driven selling. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Rivanna. We acquire and grow and retain customer relationships on behalf of clients faster and more profitably than clients can do on their own. We've won the Sales Outsourcing Provider of the Year 2 years in a row, and thought we'd share a bit of our secret sauce with everyone today in the 5 best practices for data-driven selling, because effective selling really can be taken up a level or two when you follow these types of best practices. So My goal today is to walk you through each of these 5 best practices and give you an example from the annals of Rivanna history. So we'll talk about the best practice of how to reach your sales potential and maximize customer value. We'll discuss how to drive